I originally started thinking about this video as a means of pointing the finger at Reagan and giving a very simple and hopefully digestible explanation of a major controversy during his time that I would often hear mentioned but never really elaborated on. Thankfully, while I was putting this together, I had a lot of idle time, so I found Eyes Wide Open's YouTube channel and went through a flood of emotions as he laid out the history of the CIA. It's a real shame, and I can't recommend his videos enough. This later primed me for Sean Munger's video on Reagan. I won't say too much on it and only recommend that you see it for yourself. It sheds light on how the role of the president is merely a part in the theater of politics. Thus breaking down my original intent in making the video. Of course, I could have switched topics around. There are plenty of policies that Reagan put forward fitting more squarely on his shoulders. Still, I think this topic is interesting, and here we are. Lastly, in the same breath that I mentioned Sean Munger and Eyes Wide Open, these are actual scholars with educational backgrounds on the subject who put in extensive research towards their respective works. I'm a mere nose picker who got lucky when smarter people than me put all this information together so I could turn around and make a silly video with it. So, thank you.
We did not, repeat, did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages.
Thinking of Reagan Ronald, many picture him as the great communicator, the president who ended the Cold War, the guy in all those cigarette ads, seen as the American superhero that we should all strive to be. And while that has left a deep impression on the American psyche, there is a guarded legacy to his reign that left the real impact, shaping the America that we live and die in today. Starting with Iran Contra in 1982, the Reagan administration found itself in a bind. In fear of creating Vietnam War II, Central America or bust, Congress had passed what would be known as the Bolin Amendment, banning U.S. aid to the Contras, a rebel group fighting Nicaragua's socialist government, the Sandinistas. I guess somewhere in the fine print there was a hall pass for the CIA, NSA, and whoever else wanted in on the fun to fund and aid the Contras, or maybe they just got away with not keeping Congress in the loop. Can you imagine? And still, the Reagan administration was staunchly committed to supporting them, seeing it as a part of the broader anti-communist agenda, despite the vicious extremes the Contras took. And, maybe that's what they liked about him. So, what did they do? Well, the administration had a funny way of drip-feeding Ronnie intel and advice, especially by 1985, and especially the new Chief of Staff, Ronald Reagan, by way of National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane, Nancy Reagan by way of celebrity astrologer Joanne Quigley, and head of the CIA, William Casey. These and other hands that turn the wheel we as cogs feel the pressure from rubbed their schemy little hands together and decided to use mules. Can't be the classics. Whether that be other countries hoping for U.S. favor, Swiss bank accounts, or private citizens funding the Contras themselves, acting as a glove for the U.S. to throw away once the exchange was done. Next, the administration secretly sold weapons to Iran, a country under a U.S. arms embargo, with the hopes to free American hostages that were taken between 1982 and 1985. This was achieved through Israeli and Iranian contacts. National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane spoke to and believed that through them would be building stronger ties with Iranian moderates. Once again putting on a glove and using the chain of the typical weapon sale to Israel to then funnel that to Iran. But no matter how thick and greased up that glove is, Israel transferring U.S. weapons without approval was a no-no under the Arms Export Control Act. And that no was soon turned into a yes after Reagan's approval, at least according to McFarlane. Along with other documents laying out the weapons sale as the deal evolved, the first 99 missiles were sent in 1985. While all life is precious, it took over 500 anti-tank missiles to release the first hostage, Benjamin Weir. After more weapons sales, they funneled profits to the Contras, totaling to around $20 million just from the arms sales alone. All in all, the U.S. would send approximately $300 million during the 1980s, violating both U.S. law and Reagan's own public policy against negotiating with terrorists. When the scandal broke in 1986, approximately over 2,000 missiles had been sent and only 2 hostages released. Reagan claimed he didn't know about the weapons deals or money being diverted to the Contras. Poor guy. But the damage was done. By bypassing Congress, the administration undermined the constitutional balance of powers, showing a disregard for democratic processes, maintaining a future for those with influence to act unilaterally in foreign and domestic affairs. This is where I try to hold my bias and not just come down on Reagan saying this was all his fault and he knew all about it, because for what is known and unknown about the government's internal agencies, there is much done in small circles. To fund the Contras, some factions in Nicaragua turned to drug trafficking. Cocaine from Latin America began flowing into the United States, much of it linked to networks supporting the Contras. In 1996, journalist Gary Webb published a groundbreaking series called Dark Alliance in the San Jose Mercury News, catching up to a story 10 years later. At the time, the Reagan administration was hard on its anti-drug campaign, putting an umbrella under all drugs not explicitly made legal to the public, while medical researchers at the time saw typical cocaine use as a benign threat to the public, seen as a higher-class party drug that was already popular. So what's the connection here? The United States was warned of the potential epidemic in a late 1970s international symposium held in Lima, Peru. Many of the top experts in cocaine use, one being Dr. Robert Bick, who along with several other researchers found a rising practice in cocaine smoking, stated in Dark Alliance. I have reports from California, from Chicago, and from New York about people who are smoking the substance, and I hear there are numbers of people now in San Francisco smoking the substance. Here is a chance for the federal government to engage in an educational campaign to prevent a drug abuse epidemic. The government needed to do 3 things as rapidly as possible. Number 1, find out about it. Number 2, establish some kind of collaboration with the media. And number 3, show what happens when this drug is used so that we don't get an epidemic. We need our best minds to figure out how to do this without advertising the drug. Now, instead of doing any of this, the government thought it would be a better use of their time to try and convince the Peruvians to stop growing a crop they had been harvesting for the past 2,000 years. Now, back to the scandal. The first journalists on the scene trailed along as the Iran Contra affair first unfolded, hearing murmurs of cocaine being trafficked in the U.S. only to be stonewalled when attempting to validate the claims made by the involved drug dealers. When asked, members of Congress and government administration would discredit these sources, saying they were untrustworthy drug dealers. This and worse would happen to anyone trying to break the story at the time. Later, for Gary Webb, he was initially made aware of one Oscar Danilo Blandon, a Nicaraguan-born drug trafficker with ties to the Contras and to the U.S.-friendly Somoza government before it was overthrown by the Sandinistas. Once it fell, he fled to the U.S. and began life again in Miami, then eventually moving to California. Taking on odd jobs, Blandon boasts in Dark Alliance to be one of the first to form a group with other Nicaraguan exiles to fight against the Sandinistas that he called FDN, Fuerza Democrática Nicaraguanese, in Los Angeles. Part of this group's task was to rally support and funds on behalf of the FDN's predecessor, the Legion of September 15, a violent band of Somoza's former bodyguards, men that were then based in Guatemala. About the same time that Blandon and his compatriots began their fundraising efforts in L.A., Somoza's cousin, Luis Baez de Valle, began making the rounds of the various exile groups in the United States and Central Americas to see if anyone was interested in helping Somoza fight his way back into U.S. power. A visit Baez made to former Somoza National Guard Colonel Enrique Bermudez to see if Bermudez would be willing to lead a resistance force, making him probably the highest chance of having contacts with U.S. military and intelligence community, and using that to hopefully gain U.S. backing to get these groups off the ground. Keeping in mind the previous Carter and then present Reagan administration's involvement in Nicaragua, it is no surprise that U.S. officials were aware of members of the Somoza regime. Now, eventually, through these government contacts, Bermudez was on CIA payroll and found himself heading the Legion of September 15. The Legionnaires had a safe house in Guatemala City and were training on a farm near the Honduran border called Detachment 101. Coincidentally, the farm was located in the same small town, Esquipulas, that had served as the headquarters for the CIA-backed group that overthrew the Guatemalan government in 1954. Now, let's stop right there. The CIA put their new U.S.-friendly guerrilla group in the training camp of their old U.S.-friendly guerrilla group and kept in such good contact with them that they knew morale was getting a little low at the time. And then sent their new guy in 1981, former Somoza National Guard Colonel Enrique Bermudez, now CIA agent, to come and check out the U.S.'s very own Somoza Loyalist Club, the FDN. Now, for me, this is where the connection starts. Getting further into the book, there are many people in wide levels of government and CIA exchanging hands with these two groups that would soon form together into the Contras, and knowing how to stay just at arm's length to maintain deniability. While the logistics of this far-reaching epidemic has many moving parts, it can still be seen as business as usual. Private and corporate interests with lackeys in positions of power moving the needle, all towards greater and higher profits. Drugs as the everlasting supply, the U.S. as a hungry, manipulated demand, and U.S.-backed regimes, mafias, gangs as the go-between. In the inevitable backlash of Webb's reporting and later investigations, including a 1998 CIA Inspector General report, show that while the CIA didn't directly traffic drugs, they were aware of the trafficking and essentially turned a blind eye. Why? Because these traffickers were funding the Contras and the fight against communism took priority. The ensuing crack epidemic hit black and brown communities the hardest, particularly in cities like Los Angeles, New York, and Chicago. Families were destroyed and addiction spread into a plague. Instead of addressing the root causes like poverty and systemic inequality, Reagan doubled down with the war on drugs. And here I'll tack on something Gary Webb said on the logistics towards why these communities in particular were so affected.
I think pretty much an historical coincidence that it got to South Central at the same time the Contras did with all their masses of cocaine and fueled this market. It was an instant success, as it had been in Lima, Peru when it started in 74, as it had been in Bolivia. I mean, you could track it all the way up. Everywhere it hit, it was an overnight success. Now, like I said, a lot of people disagree with that scenario. The government and the media will have you believe that crack started overnight in 1986, sort of like a lotto game. Also, one day it was there, and one day it wasn't there, next day it was there. And it was coast to coast, and it was in every city in the United States overnight, and it was a giant problem, and we have to throw everybody in jail who deals with it to crack down on this. The problem is that's not the way it happened. It started at a very small scale in Miami, started in South Central. And it spread from there, and it gradually, it came from the West Coast and the East Coast roughly the same time and met in the middle of the country about 1989. But the argument is, well, this would have happened anyway. And it very well may have. I mean, crack was on its way, there's no doubt about it. But to argue that it would have happened exactly that same way, that it would have started in South Central Los Angeles, that it would have started in black neighborhoods, I don't think you can argue that without taking into account the fact that the Nicaraguan Contras are bringing a lot of cocaine into South Central and giving it to a guy who the LA Times would later write was the man most responsible for spreading crack through Los Angeles. I mean, they did a big story on freeway rape back in 1994 and described him as the Dr. Moriarty of the crack epidemic. And when I pointed out that, yeah, that's true, but he was getting his cocaine from these Contras, suddenly we had to go back and change history. Now, the one question people have a hard time answering that believe that this theory of mine is crazy, I say, well, okay, then you explain why crack started in black neighborhoods first. Why did crack distribution networks leapfrog from one black neighborhood to another and bypass white neighborhoods and bypass Hispanic neighborhoods and bypass Asian neighborhoods? And what you will hear is this. Well, everybody knows that people down South Central are poor. Well, yeah, but, you know, there's a lot of poor neighborhoods. And they aren't all black. And then we're told, well, there was a lot of high teenage unemployment down there. And that's true too. But it's also true in Appalachia. I mean, I've worked in Kentucky for a number of years, and I would see teenage unemployment rates like Colebrook and Hazard would be 30 and 40%. So that doesn't warrant either. And then we say, well, it's because, they don't have very strong families. As if, there are no white people trying to raise kids on food stamps and the FDC and everything else. And then we're told, well, it's because crack's so cheap. That's why it was so popular. I mean, $20 is $20 no matter where you spend it. So once you eliminate these theories, and I think you can eliminate them pretty easily, there are two other theories that are left, both of which are far less comforting to think about. And one is that there's just something about people in black neighborhoods that causes them to be genetically predisposed to drug dealing, which, is a racist argument that nobody's really advocating publicly. Although I can tell you that I think we saw some of that in some of the reaction pieces that were in the New York Times and Washington Post, where they argued that, well, the reason black Americans are so upset about this story is because they're just more susceptible to conspiracy theories than other people. I mean, honest to God, those were the stories. I mean, Peter Scott can vouch for that. He read them. And I thought I'd woken up and it was 1950s again, reading stuff like this in the New York Times, but no, it was today. These analyses never pointed out that a lot of white Americans think Elvis is alive. So I suppose it makes us susceptible to conspiracy theories as well. The other reason is that, and I think this is the reason that comes closest to the truth, is that someone started bringing cheap cocaine into black neighborhoods before they brought it into other neighborhoods. And in that time period, it allowed black cocaine dealers, primarily gang-connected black cocaine dealers, to get a head start on everybody else. I mean, because the cocaine business operates pretty much like any other business. I mean, it takes time to get a business going. And the advantage South Central had is that it had a pre-existing gang infrastructure. It had gangs that were selling PCP and marijuana, so it doesn't take any time at all to start funneling cocaine into that system and spread it around. And once these networks were entrenched and established, they spread crack along cultural and ethnic lines, embodied by the street gangs. And by the late 80s, you were seeing all these reports on TV about how we've got Crips in Seattle, how we've got Crips in Kansas City, and how we've got Crips in New Orleans. And the reason for that is simple. The LA crack market got saturated. There were too many people selling crack. And so people started going out, it's called taking it on the road. And they would go out and they would start moving into other cities. And so by 1989, it was everywhere. So it seems to me that if you're looking for the root of a drug problem in a neighborhood, nothing else really matters except the drugs and where they're coming from and how they're getting there. And that's where the Contras come in. I mean, there's no doubt now, the CIA report is out, the Justice Department report is out. There's absolutely no doubt now that these men were Contras.
In 1986, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which introduced a 100-to-1 sentencing ratio for the possession or trafficking of crack when compared to sentencing for powder cocaine, meaning that someone convicted with 5 grams of crack would get the same 5-year minimum sentencing as someone convicted with 500 grams of cocaine, widely criticized as discriminatory against racial minorities who were more likely to use crack than powder cocaine. By the late 1980s, urban communities were grappling with the combined devastation of addiction, mass incarceration, and systemic neglect, all tied in part to decisions made during Reagan's presidency. So, what is the legacy of these intertwined crises? For the Iran Contra affair, it added more fuel to the fire of instability in Central America, contributing to migration crises that still affect the U.S. today. The war on drugs created a prison industrial complex disproportionately affecting communities of color, allowing the modernization of slavery. And at the time, the U.S. had condemned Iran as a pariah state and urged other nations to isolate it. So now, secretly selling arms to Iran undercut the U.S.'s moral authority and damaged relationships with allies. along with indirectly bolstering its military capabilities during the Iran-Iraq War and emboldening future aggressive actions against U.S. interests and allies in the Middle East. The crack epidemic and its fallout weren't just accidents of history. They were a result of decisions made at the highest levels of power. Reagan's presidency is largely remembered as a series of victories, but ignoring these very intentional decisions does a disservice to the communities that bore the brunt of these policies. If you want to learn more, I highly recommend Gary Webb's Dark Alliance, the 1987 Iran Contra hearings, the 1998 CIA Inspector General reports, the report from the Tower Commission, and to read more on Reagan's other killer policies that affected the economy, environment, and workforce, look for Tear Down This Myth by Will Bunch. These sources provide the evidence you need to dig deeper.
My friends, we did it. We weren't just marking time. We made a difference. We made the city stronger. We made the city freer. And we left it in good hands. All in all, not bad. Not bad at all. And so, goodbye. God bless you. And God bless the United States of America.
Hey guys, I guess that's it.